How to implement ISO 27001 Annex A 5.11 return of assets. Okay, what we're looking at here when we do our implementation is part of a wider asset management process. So you are going to have your asset management policy, the statements of what you do, and you're going to have your asset management process that sets out how you do it. Now, obviously, when we give assets to people, be they external people, be they internal people, whoever it is that we are going to give these assets to, we've got to get them back, right? So we want them back. If we don't get these assets back, it's going to represent a massive information security risk to us. Right? If we've got assets that are out there in the wild that haven't been returned, that potentially have company data, client data, customer data on, then you can see and you can foresee the problems and issues that we're going to have. So we're going to get those assets back. The best way of doing that is by making sure that we have an asset inventory. So as part of our asset management process, we're going to have an asset inventory. And you saw in the other clauses, in the other controls, how we go about that. This is specific to the return of those assets. But if we have an asset inventory, and on that asset inventory, we have allocated assets to individuals, then we know who those individuals are and we know what they've got, right? So what we're looking at here is a combination of things. We're looking at having that asset management process. We're looking at having that asset register. We're looking at making sure that assets are allocated to individuals so that we know where those assets are. And then what we're looking at is the end of the engagement with individuals. Now, usually, especially for internal employees, this is going to require an integration with HR and our HR processes. What we're looking at here is when people leave the organization, that we are making sure that we get those assets back. So integrating our asset register, our asset management process with our HR leaver process is going to allow us and make sure that we can get those assets back. It can be a little bit more complicated when we allocate assets to third parties. And what we're going to use there is our third-party supplier management process. And as part of our third-party supplier onboarding and offboarding, specifically here offboarding, again, we're going to make sure that the assets have been allocated to an individual. And when that third party is offboarded, that we get that asset back. There are going to be considerations that you have in here. Okay, so what we're looking at is return of assets. Things that I've seen on clients is physically, in our process, how do we get that asset back? What is our process for the return of that asset? Are we having an exit interview? Are we having a one-to-one meeting where that asset is returned to us? Or are we in a situation where people are remote and they're going to be returning those assets to us from remote locations? One of the top tips that I can give you here is, if we have a situation where assets are remote and they're going to be sent back to us, then yes, we've got other controls about how we handle information and how we handle it based on classification. And specifically here, we're going to be looking at couriering and using trusted third-party courier services to get that asset back to us. But my top tip here is, where technically feasible, to instigate a process of remote wipe. Right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to mitigate our risk here. So if feasible, practical and applicable, what we want to instigate is a remote wipe of the device before the device is returned to us, before it reaches the courier. There are many issues that people have had, right, with couriers. Yes, they're supposed to be guaranteed. Yes, they're supposed to come with all of these insurances. But for belts and braces, my top tip is, within your return process, where possible, get that device remotely wiped before it enters any kind of courier network or any network that comes back to you. Now, I appreciate that there are going to be situations where that isn't possible. And what you're going to have is the other 27001 controls that are going to be supporting you there, right? You're going to have encryption of that endpoint device. Ideally, you're going to have two-factor authentication. Or what you're going to have is you're going to have access and user management. What you're going to be doing is, as part of your leaver process, which we come into other controls, is restricting and removing access to data on that device. So you are going to have some elements that you can have within there. But remote wiping the device before it enters a courier network or a one-to-one meeting where that device is physically handed or that asset is physically handed back to you is going to be the way to go. When it comes to how you document that, clearly there are ISO 27001 templates. It comes as no surprise, right? I have ISO 27001 templates that can help you with that. The asset management policy, the asset management register, the physical asset register, all of the things that you need to support this process I have. And also, if you go onto my YouTube channel, I do give you how to write and how to create tutorials so that you can do that yourself. No problem with that at all. So you've implemented your asset management policy, you've defined and implemented your asset management process, you've got your end-to-end life cycle, you've got your return of assets in there. So how are you going to certify against this? When the auditor comes out, they're going to check that documentation, right? ISO 27001, as we go through many times, is documentation heavy. So you're going to make sure that you've got your documentation in place and that you can evidence that those processes have been operating effectively. What is an auditor going to check? The auditor is going to check return of assets over the last period of time, right? They're going to take a sampling approach. So what they're going to say is, have you had a situation, say within the last 3 months, 6 months or 12 months, where assets have been returned to you? Then they're going to say, walk me through the process, walk me through what you did and show me evidences that you followed the process that you have documented. The auditor is going to check that you have an up-to-date asset register. They're going to make sure that that asset register is fully up-to-date and populated with assets that they would expect to see in it. And they're going to look to make sure that those assets have been allocated to individuals. What they're also going to be looking at is if you use third parties, that you have contracts in place that cover those assets. So if you have a third-party supplier and you are allocating an asset to them, yes, they're in the asset register. Yes, you followed the process, but they're also going to be checking the contract is in place between you that covers basics around information security and what happens to that asset and how you handle it. So there are the three things usually that they're going to cover and that they're going to look through. So it's going to be a walkthrough of process, a review of documentation and evidence that you have followed it. What are the top 3 mistakes that we see here? The asset register is not up to date, right? We see this a lot. Asset registers are difficult to maintain and their bureaucracy and their overhead. And we often see the case that either the asset register hasn't been updated, assets are allocated to people that have potentially left the organization. So that's going to be easy, right? They're going to be auditing through, looking at the HR, looking at the lever process. If they then start to see people that are in the asset register that you've just told them have left the organization, that's going to be an own goal. So make sure that that asset register is up to date before the certification, ideally ongoing as part of a managed process. They're going to be looking at whether or not if you got to the return of asset and it was a destruction step, i.e. the asset was returned to you and the process then was to destroy it, then they're going to be looking at things like destruction certificates and the other controls around how you securely destroy information. But we often see that that isn't the case. What we see is that assets are returned to managers' home addresses, they're returned to offices and left in open cupboards, the usual. I've even seen them in kitchens. I've seen assets, just lying around the place. I think usually people think that it's secure. What we'll do is we'll lock it in the comms room for those people that do have an on-site comms room. Not ideal, right? So you want to make sure that those assets, if they are going to be destroyed, are destroyed. If not, that they're secured, that they're contained and kept in a secure location in line with your policy and process. And the third mistake we go through all of the time is that your documentation version control isn't up to date and it doesn't match. There's no classification, document owners aren't on there. So I bang on about that all the time. So why is it important? We've covered that at the beginning. The reason for it being important is we do not want assets out in the wild. We do not want assets leaving the organization. When people leave the organization, we don't want to be putting at risk our customers, our employees. We don't want to put their data at risk. We don't want to put at risk our intellectual property and our IP, especially if you've got developers that are leaving the organization or people that have been working on product implementations. So this is a really important one, right, for making sure that you maintain your confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. It isn't particularly hard. There isn't really a lot to go through. It is part of standard asset management. Just be sure that you have your process, that it's fully documented and you can evidence it, and you're going to be absolutely golden. So that was ISO 27001 Annex A 511 return of assets. Stick with me, watch the next video as we work our way through the Annex A clauses, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.